Welcome to Catholic Culture Audiobooks, a production of CatholicCulture.org and under the patronage of St. John Henry Newman. Today's reading, Letter to Honoratus, by St. Augustine of Hippo, translated by Sister Mary Magdalene Muller, OSF, narrated by James T. Majewski. To our holy brother and fellow bishop, Honoratus, Augustine sends greetings in the Lord. I sent to your grace a copy of the letter which I wrote to our brother and fellow bishop, Quod Vult Deus, thinking that thus I would be relieved of the burden you imposed when you asked my advice upon a course of action amidst the dangers which have befallen our times. Although that letter was brief, I believe it omitted nothing which was necessary for me to say in reply, and sufficient for the one who awaited it. I said, indeed, that those who wish and are able to move to places of safety should not be prevented, and that there should be no breaking of the ties of our ministry, whereby Christ's love has bound us not to desert the churches which we ought to serve. Here, then, are the words which I wrote in that letter. Since our ministry is so necessary for God's people, however few they may be, they should not remain without it. Thus we should pray to the Lord, Be thou unto us a God, a protector, and a place of refuge. This advice, however, as you write, is not sufficient. You are worried that we are striving to act contrary to the Lord's precept and example when he tells us to flee from one city to another. We recall his words when he said, And when they shall persecute you in this city, flee into another. Still, who would believe that the Lord wanted the flocks which he bought with his own blood to be abandoned by that necessary ministry without which they cannot live? Is this what he did when, as a child, he fled into Egypt carried by his parents, not yet having established any churches which we might say were deserted by him? When the Apostle Paul, to escape his enemy, was let down through the window in a basket and escaped his hands, did he deprive any church of his necessary ministry? Did not the other brethren who were living there supply what was needed? Indeed, it was in accordance with their wish that the apostle acted, in order that he might be saved for the church, since he alone was sought by the persecutor. Therefore, let Christ's servants, the ministers of his word and sacrament, do what he taught and permitted. Certainly, let them flee from one city to another, when one in particular is sought by the persecutors. Only see to it that the church is not abandoned by others who are not so persecuted, in order that they may give nourishment to their fellow servants who they know could not otherwise live. However, when the danger is common to all, bishops, clergy, and laity, let not those who need others be abandoned by the ones they need. For this reason, either they should all move to places of safety, or those who must remain should not be abandoned by those who must supply their ecclesiastical needs. Let them live together or suffer together whatever the Father wishes them to endure. If it should happen that some suffer more, others less, or all equally, it is clear that they suffer for others who, although able to escape from such evils by flight, prefer to remain in order not to abandon the needs of others. This is the greatest proof of that charity which the Apostle John commends when he says, As Christ laid down his life for us, so we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. Both those who flee and those who cannot because bound by duties, if they are caught and made to suffer, clearly do so for themselves and not for the brethren. On the other hand, those who suffer because of their unwillingness to abandon their brethren who needed them for their Christian welfare, without any doubt they lay down their lives for the brethren. Therefore, what we have heard a certain bishop say, If the Lord has commanded us to flee in those persecutions where the fruit of martyrdom is possible, how much more should we flee useless sufferings when there is an invasion of hostile barbarians? This is really true and acceptable only for those not bound by ties of ecclesiastical duty. When, even though he could escape, a man does not flee from the attacks of the enemy in order not to abandon the ministry of Christ, for without it men cannot live or become Christians, he finds a greater fruit of his charity than one who flees, not for his brethren's sake but his own, even if he is captured and suffers martyrdom for refusing to deny Christ. What then is it that you wrote in your former letter? You say, indeed, if we must continue in our churches, I do not see what the advantage will be for ourselves or for the people, except that men will succumb before our very eyes, women will be dishonored, churches burned, we ourselves die of torture when something we do not possess is asked of us. Surely God is able to hear the prayers of his family and to ward off disasters which they fear. However, because of something uncertain, there should not be a definite abandonment of duty. For in that event there is certain ruin for the people, not only in things pertaining to this life, but also in those of that other life which must be cared for with incomparably greater attention and anxiety. Even if our fear that something might happen in the places where we are were certain, all the people on whose account we should remain would have fled earlier and freed us from the necessity of remaining. There is no one indeed who says that ministers should remain when there no longer is anyone to whom they should minister. Thus, in truth, the holy bishops fled from Spain, when some of the people had already departed in flight, some were killed, others were scattered in captivity. Many more bishops stayed in the thick of these dangers, because those on whose account they remained were there. Moreover, if some did desert their people, this is exactly what we say should not happen. Such men indeed were not influenced by divine authority, but were either deceived by human error or constrained by fear. Why then do they think they should obey without discrimination upon reading the command to flee from one city to another, when they do not tremble at the thought of the hireling who sees the wolf coming and flees because he has no care for the sheep? Furthermore, why do they not strive to understand those two true statements of the Lord, the one where flight is either permitted or commanded, and the other where it is blamed and censured? For thus they would find them not contrary to each other, as in fact they are not. How is this discovered, unless notice is made of that which I discussed above, namely, that we, Christ's ministers, should flee under the stress of persecution from the places in which we are? This should happen, however, only when there are no Christian people to whom to minister, or when the necessary ministry can be performed by others who have no reason for flight. So the apostle fled, as I mentioned above, let down in a basket when he alone was sought by the persecutor. Since the remaining ministers were not under a similar strain, priests were not lacking there, nor the church abandoned. The holy Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, similarly fled when the Emperor Constantius gave orders to apprehend him in particular, while the Catholic people who remained in Alexandria were by no means deserted by the other ministers. However, when the people remain and the ministers flee, taking away the ministry, what else will this be but that damnable flight of hirelings who have no care for the sheep? Indeed, the wolf will come, not a man, but the devil, who has frequently persuaded the faithful to become apostates when they were deprived of the daily ministry of the Lord's body. Therefore, your weak brother for whom Christ died shall perish, not through your knowledge, but your ignorance. As for those who are not deceived by error in this matter, but are overcome with fear, why do they not struggle bravely against their terror with God's compassion and help, so that they may not experience evils incomparably more burdensome and much more fearful? This happens when love of God burns brightly and the pleasure of the world does not exhale its fumes. Moreover, charity says, "Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is scandalized and I am not on fire?" Charity, however, is from God. Therefore let us pray that it may be given by him who commands it. For this reason, let us fear more, lest Christ's sheep, who will die some time by some kind of death, will be killed in the heart by the sword of spiritual wickedness, than bodily by a sword of iron. Let us fear, lest, when the inner sense has been corrupted, purity of faith will die, rather than that women will be violently dishonored in body. Chastity, indeed, is not spoiled by violence, if it is preserved in the mind, nor is it destroyed in the body, when the will of the one who suffers does not shamefully take pleasure in the flesh, but without any real consent endures another's action. Let us fear lest living stones will be destroyed when we desert them, rather than that the stones and wood of earthly buildings will be burned in our absence. Let us fear lest the members of Christ's body will be killed by a lack of spiritual nourishment, rather than that the members of our body will be tortured when overcome by the enemy's attack. Not that these things are not to be avoided, if possible. Rather, they are to be endured, if unavoidable, without impiety. Unless, perchance, someone asserts that he is not a wicked minister who withdraws his ministry, which is necessary for devotion, at the time when it is most essential. When these dangers have reached their height, and there is no chance for flight, do we not consider how large a congregation of both sexes and of every age usually gathers in church? Some are eager for baptism, others for reconciliation, still others for acts of penance, all of them for the consolation, administration, and distribution of the sacraments. If, then, ministers are lacking, how much destruction comes upon those who depart from this world unregenerated or bound by sin? How great, moreover, is the grief of the faithful, their relatives, who will not have them with them in the rest of eternal life. Finally, how great is the groaning of all, and how great the blasphemy of some, because of the absence of ministers and their ministry. See what the fear of temporal evils effects, and how great increase of eternal evils lies therein. If, however, ministers are present, there is help for all, according to the measure of the strength which the Lord supplies. Some are baptized, others reconciled, none is deprived of the communion of the Lord's body. All are consoled, edified, encouraged to ask God, who is mighty, to avert the evils which are feared. They are prepared, however, for either event, so that, if the chalice cannot pass from them, His will may be done, who can wish no evil. You surely see now what you had said you did not see, namely, how much benefit Christians obtain if the presence of Christ's ministers is not wanting to them in the presence of evils. You also see the harm that is done by their absence, for they then seek their own, not the things which are of Jesus Christ, and they have not that charity of which we read, "It seeketh not her own," nor do they imitate him who said, "Not seeking that which is profitable to myself, but to many, that they may be saved." He, too, would not have fled from the snares of that persecuting prince if he had not wanted to save himself for others who needed him. Therefore the apostle says, "But I am straitened between two, having a desire to be dissolved and to be with Christ, a thing by far the best. But to abide still in the flesh is needful for you." At this point, someone may say that, when such dangers are threatening, God's ministers should flee in order to save themselves for the church's benefit in more peaceful times. Some may do this, provided that others are not lacking to supply the church's ministrations which they deserve. Athanasius did this, as we mentioned above. Indeed, the Catholic faith, which his words and zeal defended against the Arian heretics, knew how necessary and beneficial to the church it was that he remain in the flesh. However, when there is a common danger, there is a greater reason to fear that someone may be thought to do this, not from the desire to be of service, but from a fear of dying. If more harm results from the example of flight, than good by the duty of living. On no condition should this be done. Finally, holy David, lest he be exposed to the dangers of battle and perchance the lamp of Israel be extinguished, withdrew from his persecutors. However, he did not act presumptuously, otherwise he would have attracted imitators of his cowardice who would have believed his action arose not from thoughtfulness of the benefit to others, but from the confusion of his own fear. Another question arises which we should not overlook. If indeed this usefulness is not to be disregarded, so that when some disaster threatens, certain ministers should flee in order to be saved to care for those who will survive after the trouble, what should happen when all seem destined to perish unless some flee? What if the persecution is limited to this extent, that only the church's ministers are pursued? What shall we say? Should the ministers abandon the church in flight so it will not be left in a worse condition by them when they die? If, however, the laity are not sought after unto death, they can somehow hide their bishops and clergy in accordance with God's help, in whose power all things are, and who can, by his wonderful might, save even those who do not flee. Still, we are asking what we should do, that we may not be considered tempting God by expecting divine miracles in all circumstances. Certainly, when the danger is common to the laity as well as the clergy, the storm is not the same as the danger to merchants and sailors who are together on a ship. Far be it from us to value this ship of ours so lightly that the sailors, and especially the pilot, should abandon it in time of danger, even if they can escape by leaping into a small boat or even by swimming. In the case of those whom we think will perish because of our desertion, it is not their temporal death we fear, for that must come some time, but their eternal death. This can come if there is not watchfulness, and cannot come if there is. However, in the common danger of this life, why do we think that, wherever there is an attack by the enemy, all the clergy and not all the laity are going to die, so that those for whom the clergy are necessary will end this life together? Or why do we not expect that, as some of the laity will survive, so also shall some of the clergy, and these will be able to perform the necessary ministry? However, would that the discussion among God's ministers were over the question of who should remain and who should flee, lest the church be abandoned by either the flight or the death of all. Such indeed will be the struggle among them when both are on fire with charity and both satisfy love. As far as I can see, if this discussion cannot be decided in any other way, those who should remain and those who are to flee must be chosen by lot. Indeed, those who say they should rather flee will either seem timid because unwilling to endure threatening danger, or arrogant because deeming themselves more necessary to the church so that they must be preserved. Furthermore, perhaps those who are better will choose to lay down their lives for their brethren, and thus those will be saved by flight whose lives are less useful because of less experience in counsel and government. Nevertheless, those who are wise and devout will oppose those whom they see ought to live and yet prefer to die rather than to flee. Thus, then, it is written, "The lot suppresseth contentions, and determineth even between the mighty." In difficulties of this sort, God is a better judge than men. Whether it is proper to call better men to the fruit of suffering and to spare the weak, or to make the latter stronger in enduring misfortune, and take them from this life since their lives cannot be as beneficial to the church as that of the others. If there is a casting of lots, the procedure will be unusual, but if so, who will dare to censure it? Only the ignorant or envious will fail to praise it in fitting words. If, however, this plan is unsatisfactory because there is no precedent available, let no one cause the church's ministry, which is especially necessary and due in such great dangers, to cease. Let no one consider his own person in such a light that, even if he seems to excel in some grace, he proclaim himself more worthy of life and therefore of flight. Whoever thinks thus indeed pleases himself, but if he says it, he displeases everyone. Surely there are people who think that bishops and priests who do not flee, but remain in the midst of such dangers, deceive the people. The latter do not flee then, for they see their leaders remaining. However, it is easy to avoid this blame and reproach by addressing these people as follows. Let not the fact that we are not fleeing from this place deceive you. We are staying here, not for our own sake, but for yours, so that we may not fail to minister whatever we recognize as necessary for your salvation, which is in Christ. If, therefore, you wish to flee, you will release us from the bonds which hold us. This, I think, should be said whenever it seems truly advantageous to move to safer places. If at this statement all or some should say, "We are in his power whose wrath no one escapes no matter where he goes. Moreover, his mercy can be found wherever one may be, even if he does not wish to go elsewhere, whether prevented by definite duties or unwilling to strive after uncertain places of refuge. Thus he will succeed not in ending, but in exchanging dangers." Undoubtedly, they should not be abandoned by the Christian ministry. If, however, the people prefer to depart after hearing these words, the ministers who were remaining on their account need not stay, for the people there no longer need their ministrations. Therefore, whoever flees when the church's necessary ministry is not lacking because of his flight, does what the Lord commanded or allowed. However, one who so flees that Christ's flock is deprived of the nourishment on which it lives, he is that hireling who sees the wolf coming and flees because he has no care for the sheep. These facts, most beloved brother, I have considered and have written to you in truth and certain love, because you asked my advice. However, I have not commanded you, in case you find something better. Nevertheless, we can find nothing better to do in these dangers than offer prayers to the Lord our God, that he may have pity on us. With his help, some prudent and holy men have merited to will and to accomplish this, namely, not to desert their churches, and in the face of calumny, not to depart in the least from the intention of their purpose. This has been Letter to Honoratus by St. Augustine of Hippo, translated by Sister Mary Magdalene Muller, OSF, narrated by James T. Majewski, copyright 1952 by the Catholic University of America Press, production copyright 2020 by Trinity Communications. This podcast is brought to you by CatholicCulture.org and made possible by listener support. To donate, please visit CatholicCulture.org/donate/audio. That's CatholicCulture.org/donate/audio.